Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's great to see people signing in from all over the world again. I'm Peter Hurst, and it's my pleasure to be welcoming you to the latest in the Innovation at Work webinar series here from MIT Sloan Executive Education, where today's topic is doing hybrid work well. And this is incredibly timely, we feel, and incredibly relevant to, I think, literally all of us who have to work or used to have to work in some kind of office setting. We're all grappling with this question of how are we going to make our work pattern, our work lives effective as we begin to return to the new normal, whatever that might be. And to help us think about this, and really from a very research-driven perspective, we're very fortunate to be joined by Professor Erin Kelly, from the MIT Sloan School of Management, where she is the Sloan Distinguished Professor of Work and Organization Studies, and also Faculty Director of the Good Companies, Good Jobs Initiative. Erin is a really prolific researcher in sociology, management, and she publishes in interdisciplinary journals, has twice received the Rosabeth Moss-Kanter Award. She has a new book out with Phyllis Moen, Overload, How Good Jobs Went Bad and What to Do About It, which was published in March last year. And her work really investigates policies, workplace policies and management practices, taking a really rigorous research approach, thinking about questions like how do firms, workers and families have really focus on equity, well-being and organizational performance and achieve all three of those important goals. So thank you, Erin, for joining us today. We're really looking forward to this discussion. Erin also has a course that she teaches in executive education, leading a diverse workforce. So she might share a little bit of us about the upcoming sessions of that program. But for today, what we're going to focus on are essentially these questions that you're seeing on the screen now. How do we find ways to decrease unnecessary work, increase productivity, and increase everyone's control over their time? How do we work with our teams, employees, to identify and implement change? In particular, what are attributes of flexible work policies that are going to vary from organization to organization, but how do we think about doing that? And she's going to introduce us to a toolkit that will help us with all of that. As you heard at the beginning, this hopefully will be very interactive. Please do feel free to post thoughts and comments in the chat as we go along. Put questions in the Q&A tab, and I will come back in a little while and help go through those questions and address any thoughts and questions that you have coming up. So with that, I would like to once again welcome Professor Erin Kelly to the stage and invite her to talk to us about doing hybrid work well. Thank you, Erin.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you, team, for having me here. I'm really delighted to have this chance to share some of my research and then the implications of that research for the current era and, for moving forward in the interesting and times that we're in these days. I'm also very much looking forward to audience questions and to the dialogue as we go forward. So as Peter mentioned, the question at the center of my research agenda is how can we organize work to promote well-being while also supporting or ideally improving organizational performance. And a sub-question there is, how do we do that in a way that attends to equity, to supporting a diverse workforce and creating inclusive cultures? And as has already been mentioned, last year I published this book with my co-author. The title is Overload. And obviously the research was conducted well before COVID-19, but it's highly relevant to this pandemic period, to this post-pandemic period, or this in-between period that we're in now, the post-lockdown period in particular, because remote work options were a critical piece of the innovation that we studied and that I'm going to draw on to guide our discussion today. So we all know what has happened in the last year. Remote work increased dramatically for many professionals, managers, and people in other white-collar jobs over the last year. And there was so much quick learning on how do we get the work done virtually and how do we collaborate in new ways. Necessity was the mother of invention. And that was an exciting time to really demonstrate to people who may have been skeptical before that remote work is feasible for many different jobs. However, you probably realize the story is not all rosy. Recent surveys find between 35% of employees, find about 35% of employees say they feel exhausted, and 40% are considering looking for new jobs. I know we have a truly international audience today, and I believe this comes from some global surveys from the McKinsey group. So I think that this may or may not apply to your exact location, but the general thrust is there. Another study found that about 70% of knowledge workers said they felt burned out, used up, exhausted and unable to perform at their best. And many managers and executives worry that even though we know people can work exclusively from home for a period, that may not be the best path to high engagement and to innovation. So we're all facing this question about what are the new routines? What are the new rules? How are we going to figure this out together? And the answer is not obvious, which is why I've left this blank. But I do think we can draw on research findings, including, of course, my own work, but also work that I have studied over the years, to have some guidance on how to do remote work and particularly hybrid strategies well. So our research was conducted as part of a federally funded collaboration called the Work, Family, and Health Network. And I believe our study lays out the promise of doing hybrid strategies well and identifies some pitfalls to avoid. The core data come from a study lasting almost 5 years involving about 1,000 employees and managers in the IT division of a US Fortune 500 firm. Of course, we draw on other research as well, and I've studied nursing homes, and I'm currently studying warehouse workers, but today's focus is really on people who are doing work that can be done offsite, at least for some jobs and in some positions. So let's pause here before I jump into the study findings and the implications for 2021 and beyond, to do a check-in on your situation and your own expectations for employees if you are a people manager. So I believe we're going to open up poll number 1, which asks you to pick from a long list. You're going to take a little time to read this. What describes your current work practices? I'll give you a minute or two to do that. Terrific, thank you so much. So I do not know, I'm sorry to say, Lauren or Janice, I should have asked this, how to share these findings. Can you do that? And if you're still finishing, feel free to go ahead. Or maybe folks are seeing them.
Yes, I shared the results, Erin.
Okay, terrific. So thank you so much. So we have wide variety, but I would say, as expected, perhaps for an audience that finds their way to MIT Exec Ed, many people have the capacity to work from home and are probably in positions where that was common before the pandemic. We have 26% exclusively working from home, and then another 24% who are primarily working from home. One thing that I want to call out for you with regard to this is the fact that remote work and the flexibility to set your work patterns are related but not the same thing. And so we are seeing in some organizations where people are asked to do remote work or invited to do remote work, but are either told that they must work off-site because an office is closing or something like that, or asked to commit to specific days, which provides some opportunity to work in a different setting, but doesn't provide the flexibility that many people value. Now let's go to the second poll and ask you to complete this. The idea here is to think forward. I put this all the way to 1 year from now, thinking about your preferred model. If you are a people manager, you have people who report to you, what would you like to see your employees doing? Great. So I'm going to also call this one. Thank you. And so here we see, I did a broad swath here, 10 to 95% of weekly hours worked remotely. And I put that broad swath because one of the points I'm going to hit home on repeatedly is that the type of work should determine the work practices, right? And so you may have been thinking of a team with various roles, and I wanted to have a broad swath there. And most of you say you're imagining that employees can have that flexibility to determine their work patterns, but a substantial portion also say the ideal would be, I have some predictability, I have some expectation, and there's commitments to specific days in advance. And that may be perfectly appropriate depending on how much coordination and collaboration and customer-facing work is involved here. Not surprisingly, again, for people who have self-selected into this session, there are only a few of you whose preference would be no remote work. And also there are a relatively small number who are anticipating exclusive remote work as the ideal. Great, thank you so much for helping us kind of see that variation and set this context. Part of the reason I wanted to, let's close that as well. Part of the reason I wanted to have some input from you all was to call out the way that we think about these terms, and that on-site exclusively had been the default for so many organizations. Now it turns out I'm going to talk about flexibility had often been allowed, or remote work had often been allowed in small ways and negotiated ways. But now we're in, then we switched all the way down to the bottom, many of us in pandemic period, particularly in portions of the US, where we had significant lockdowns, where people spent months doing exclusive remote work. And so hybrid kind of means everything in the middle. And I wanted to call out that I'm using hybrid to mean a mix of remote work and on-site work. But that can be set up in a fixed way, or it can be set up in a more flexible way. And my research suggests, and actually quite a bit of other social science research on the benefits of having control and a sense of agency and choice, suggests that the hybrid and flexible model is going to be appreciated most by employees and therefore benefit the organization as well. So moving forward in the rest of this talk, we'll talk about how can that happen in a way that feels feasible and practical. Now I'm going to do one more thing and then we'll jump back in. Just to ask the very simple question, and please put this just into the chat. Given the way things are today, how do you feel about your work? Just one word or one phrase, first response, don't overthink it. Love it. We see a wide variety of things. I see fun, I see great, I see productive, love it. But I also see stressed, overloaded, numb just jumped out at me. So we have appreciation of the current practices, but we also have exhausted, stressed, and overloaded or overwhelmed. So now I'm going to switch us back to the research findings. And it turns out that stress and exhaustion that many of you are reporting is quite common. And of course, as you know, was found in professional and managerial settings well before COVID too. So in our study, which was conducted again several years ago now, we asked 25 teams in the IT division of this Fortune 500 firm, the broad question, given the way things are today, how do you feel? And they could go put whatever they wanted on the board, and we just snapshotted those and turned them into this word cloud, where as with this crowd, there are some positive positive attributions, positive comments, of course. But there's also a lot of emphasis on the stress and the exhaustion and the desire to have some space away. And so one of the things I would like to point out here is that in this description of our work experiences, family is in here. But it's not all about work-family issues or work-life balance. My co-author, Phyllis Moen, and I have studied the topic of work and family for over 20 years, but our thinking evolved during this study because it became clear that many people, regardless of their life stage and their family situation, were feeling that work had become very intense. And so we locate the root concern of overload, not in how work and family come together, but in all that people are asked to do at work. So we start with the recognition that many professionals and managers know they have good pay and benefits, but are feeling that the current ways of working aren't sustainable. Now, it's interesting because the pandemic period for some folks created a little bit of space to reflect on that. And it may have created a positive sense of, I have some more control over my time and I have more say over how I do my work because I'm not in the office. But it also, the pandemic period was ramping up because so many of us were trying to do our old jobs and figure out all the new stuff simultaneously. And so then, and I would argue now, we need to pay attention to overload as the sense that there's too much asked of you and your team given limited resources. And actually, that's a classic definition of stress. Too many demands as compared to the resources such as time or staff to accomplish what is expected. The company invited us in because key executives were concerned about burnout, about losing people who were unwilling to work in exhausting ways any longer, and about the difficulty of attracting younger people in particular and talented workers. The company culture was kind of described as sped up and moving fast, and people recognized they were just hanging on and not doing their best work. We also heard from many employees and managers that they felt exhausted and withdrawn, well beyond what they put on the board in our interviews and our in-depth surveys. People would say things like, I used to love my job, right? The job was an excellent match with them, but the work conditions had shifted significantly, and now they resented it, and they felt so used up by it that many of them were considering leaving. Now, we identified some specific practices that contributed to this sense of overload. I'm not going to go into each of those, but there are ways that we do our work that kind of exacerbate this sense of having too much to do, including multitasking and splitting our attention during the workday. I have been on Zoom and other webinars as well, and so I know we've all gotten much better at this over the last year. So what we wanted to do in our study was evaluate a workplace change that we call a work redesign approach. And specifically, we called it the STAR initiative in the firm we studied. And as Peter mentioned, the toolkit for the STAR initiative, including all the training materials, is freely available on this Work Family Health website. But the key elements are that we oriented people to dual agenda goals, changes that are good for the company and good for employees. And I'm going over this now because it's going to lay the foundation for what the principles we should use in setting up hybrid work in the current period. So a dual agenda perspective. Secondly, everyone has the opportunity to work from home. So flexibility is the new normal rather than an accommodation, or what Phyllis Moen, my colleague, would call the mother may I model, where an individual raises her hand or his hand, and unfortunately in the past it was more often her hand, to ask for something that was seen as a special favor or as an accommodation that would be allowed but was not fully legitimate, was not really the way we work around here. So in the work redesign approach, or in this STAR initiative, teams had the opportunity to talk together about how they wanted to get their work done. And one part of that was, really fairly open access to remote work options. Now, in this context, people got to choose whatever they wanted. And on average, they chose to work 55% of their hours in the office. But some folks chose to be in the office 5 days a week. Others chose to be in the office once every 2 weeks or once a month, very little. And this is what I would call hybrid flexing, that terminology that has emerged in the last year or two. A key point here is that team conversations need to be at the heart of the approach, and they were in this study that I'm reporting on. So there was space and guidance to figure out what worked for a given team, given their tasks, their clients or customers, their preferences. The teams had a chance to strategize about how they wanted to communicate and coordinate effectively now that they're working in more distributed ways. And here there was also an explicit push to identify, what are we going to stop doing? If we're feeling overloaded, what are the low value tasks that we can, cut so that we are doing our core work, what they would call our real work, in this case, the technical work tied to being a professional in the IT division during the workday, rather than cramming that into the evenings and weekends. Finally, the initiative provided managers training on the shift in their roles. So that included an explicit message that supporting people's personal lives is not a nice thing to do, it's a critical part of being a good manager, and gave people some strategies for expressing that support. Managers were asked to manage the work, not be what they would call hall monitors who enforced the rules about schedules or about remote work, about when you logged on or off. And most managers love that change because it gave them a chance to treat people as respected professionals. So what we did in our study was evaluate this through a group randomized trial, which is basically a fancy way of saying a field experiment, where we identified, 56 units in this division, and half of them were randomly chosen to go through the work redesign initiative, and half of them continued on with existing policies. Now, this is really important because we're comparing apples to apples. They're all in the same firm. They have the same job roles. They're doing similar work. And so we can really see how this shift to a hybrid flexible model, or what we call a work redesign approach, impacted the employees and the organization. So key findings here are, again, compared to their peers in the same firm who served as our control group, those who had a chance to engage in this hybrid flexible approach had higher job satisfaction, less burnout, better work-life integration. And again, I've said that's part of it, but not the whole story. Better mental health, including less stress and psychological distress. Better sleep, measured through the sleep watches we had people wear, the actigraphy watches, and also better cardiometabolic health. So among older workers and others who were at higher risk of cardiovascular disease at the beginning of the study, we saw improvements in their health compared to the control group. Now, interestingly, we had neither benefits nor problems that we could measure in internal measures of productivity or quality. But because the employees who had this chance to work in the hybrid flexible way, who went through the STAR initiative, appreciated it so much, they were 40% less likely to quit over the 3 years after its implementation. And that produced a high return on investment because of the reduced turnover largely. So those are the study findings. This can work, and it can work in a rigorously evaluated study comparing people in the same firm doing the same types of jobs. So what do we need to learn from this for the current era and going forward? So we have identified 5 principles, kind of taking a step back from our specific study, that I'm going to offer you as guidance to setting up hybrid strategies well. The first is just get the message that remote work is only part of the equation, right? We need to think about when, where, and how people work and how they work together. And this happens through team conversations so that individual employees and managers are able to craft the way they work and perform at a high level, right? So adapting a simple work from home policy, or adapting a simple policy that says everyone's on site 3 days and at home 2 days, that sounds appealing, and I understand clarity can be useful, but you still need to create space and time and guidance for the team to figure out their new normal in order to see these kinds of benefits. The second point is that remote work isn't actually the critical driver of the positive changes that I've laid out. So our research and a lot of other research points to 2 psychological mechanisms that are behind this. The first is a sense of choice or control on the part of the employees, and a sense of being trusted and supported by managers and colleagues. So it's not the exact number of days in the office that's the critical thing. It's that sense of being treated as a trusted professional that matters. One implication here is that company policies that send everyone home full-time, perhaps to save on real estate costs, are risky, right? So the experience of not being able to go be a part of a work community is completely different than the experience of deciding which days or how much you'd like to do remote work. Third, decisions about remote work need to be driven by the specifics of the work being done. So we're solving for both work effectiveness and work-life balance or personal preferences. And those need to be on the table as the guiding principles from the beginning. Previous research conducted before the pandemic is clear that exclusively working from home is tricky, and that moderate remote work seems to be the sweet spot where job satisfaction stays high and relationships with coworkers are also strong, which then positively affects job performance. In this pre-pandemic world, and of course there may be industry differences, but the bulk of the research suggests that those who were exclusively working from home were more likely to feel isolated, and also that negatively affected their job performance. So I'm not saying here that 100% remote work can't be successful, but we can't assume that because we powered through in the last 15 months, many of us with exclusive remote work, that that is a smart strategy going forward. Exclusive remote work has to be really put together carefully to avoid those concerns about decaying social relationships, decaying mentoring, and decaying commitment there. The fourth point is that remote work can actually be a rope that we hang ourselves with, right? It can seem like flexibility, but it can turn into an inability or a limited capacity to rest, recover, recuperate, and do the kinds of smart pulling back that allow us to do our best work. So we all know the dividing line between home and work disappears when we work from home, and it's easy to have that slide into longer hours. My own current research with colleagues shows that working from home outside of normal work hours doesn't benefit well-being and actually increases work-life conflicts and plans to quit. So it's important as part of these team conversations about how we're going to work going forward to be explicit that setting boundaries is appropriate, and to have joint conversations about immediacy of responses, that we're not going to reward people for being the first to respond to the chat, the Slack, the email, etc. That we're going to focus on the work performance and not on instant communication, and that we know when we need to push for faster communication and when we can take a breath and step back. With those safeguards in place in our study, we saw that working from home increased dramatically, right? Moved to that 55% on average, but total work hours didn't increase. So that is a key. We don't want to have remote work and even more stressed or burned out employees. The fifth principle, and my last comment before we switch to Q&A, is it's important to collect data to learn and adapt as you go. And in particular, I would suggest monitoring the impact of new work practices on 3 dimensions: organizational performance, employee engagement and well-being, and equity and inclusion. So I want to elaborate on this last point. In the years before COVID, many companies allowed flexible work arrangements, but also penalized them, right? So those who worked long hours in the office and were willing to travel at any time were often seen as what we call in the scholarship ideal workers. They lived up to the ideal worker norm and were seen as more productive, committed, and serious, regardless of their actual work performance. People could technically seek flexibility, including remote work, but they often paid a price in their careers that we call flexibility stigma. And so because of differences in family commitments, of course, there's variation across families, but on average, women were more willing to pursue those formal flexibility arrangements, even though they might come with a penalty. So inadvertently, flexibility reinforced gender inequality. Now we're in a new era, I realize, and we would hope that working from home and other flexible work arrangements would be seen as fully legitimate, acceptable, and normal at this point. But it's important that we continue to monitor the data to be sure that those who seek out remote work options or hybrid work options in particular do not then face career consequences. So in conclusion, I think this is a really exciting moment. We can reimagine the future of work. All of you are located in organizations and in local context where some things will feel practical and some things will feel challenging. What I've tried to do here is take a step back and offer some research-based principles to guide your thinking. I'll also say I love to get to hear what happens as companies change their policies and practices. And so if you're interested in exploring a research partnership, my PhD students and I would be happy to chat about that. And I have my email here as well. So thanks so much for the attention. And I am looking forward to chatting with Peter and to your questions and insights as well.
Great, thank you so much, Erin. And as you can see, when I came back, I switched my background picture to a photograph taken in our office of the exec ed team, which was switched to a very flexible. We switched probably 5 years ago to a very flexible approach to working, and it's been fascinating to hear the results of your research that are very relevant to the experience that we've had, and certainly given that experience myself, I think many of the people listening in, looking at the comments as they're coming in to chat, are having many of those kinds of reactions as well. That, you know, much of what you've said, there are positive and negative examples, I think, that we can all feel that are inspired by and reinforced by your research. Speaking of the research in particular, there were some, I think, a thread of questions, and I'll just put a couple of themes together here around, if you like, measurement. I mean, how do we know, in the case of your research, how did you measure things like productivity, the things that people have as concerns? You mentioned, sort of the social engagement, how important that might be as well. And so people are, I think, are very curious about, when you're conducting research like this, or when we're, as you advocated at the end, trying to monitor what's going on in terms of the implications for our organizations and the outcomes, what's your advice on what sorts of things we can be measuring and how?
Sure, I love that question, of course. Yeah, so we used, there are some established social science measures of job satisfaction, of work-life conflict, of organizational commitment and turnover intentions. And we did repeated surveys of the same people over time, right? And compared to their peers who didn't have the extra flexibility and hadn't been through this work redesign conversation. And so that's how we measure most of our individual outcomes. Now, turnover, we just have company data on who left. We have company data on their performance ratings from their manager. And then we had company data on the internal metrics that were most important to them. So, largely that was software development metrics of, when products were launched and defect rates, and, to measure quality and time where systems were down. And so for those productivity outcomes, we didn't see positive benefits, but we didn't see any problems that arose either. Peter, let me just mention, and I am not sure how to handle this, but I'm part of a research team with Harvard School of Public Health faculty as well. And next week, September 9th, we're launching a new website on work design for health that has a set of recommended measures. So I'd love to figure out, I don't have, it's not live today, so I can't just pop it in the chat, but I'd love to share that with you and your team and perhaps be able to share it with the attendees as well after September 9th.
I think we can certainly do that. We'll be emailing out the presentations and other materials anyway. So that would, I think, be very helpful to people. Another set of questions, I think, are really diving into, sort of going from the theory to the practice.
Sure.
what are if I rephrase some of these questions, what are some of the principal risks that you think we really need to be wary of as we try to implement or return to the office, but in a new way? I mean, the questions that I'm saying, and thank you for keep them coming, have a lot to do with people looking for advice on how do we ensure that teams really are still remaining connected. There was a question: is the social interaction that happens in the physical workplace correlated with what you're seeing in the workplace satisfaction? And how important is it for us to really enforce that in our teams and in our organizations, even if we have people that are saying they'd quite like to be 100% remote?
Yeah, so I hear that. I think it does make sense to focus on how do we stay connected. That's an important key idea. But I would say that anything that is experienced by employees as removing their choice is tricky, right? So forced fun often doesn't work. I think that our research suggests that the guiding principles should be what's needed to do our work well, together, and to do our work well together over the medium to long term, right? So there's a sense that, everything was all hands on deck in the last 15 months, but some of those positive coworker relationships have decayed over time. And so we either need to come back together and take the time to reconnect as people and as people oriented to the same goals, right? To reconnect to that sense of shared purpose. Or if we can't come together physically, we need to develop new strategies for maintaining that connection in a remote or distributed way. One of the interesting things is, many teams were already distributed geographically well before the pandemic. And so we can learn from those distributed teams about, even though we're rushed, how do we take some time to build those connections? When is it worthwhile to bring people together physically on a quarterly basis or a biannual basis to kind of rebuild that social connection or capital?
Great, that's very helpful advice. Thank you. Moving on to some. There was another set of questions which I think were focusing on your observation. I think you made the comment that, for example, total work hours didn't change when you introduced flexibility in the experiment. And I think there's an interest in how do we understand this question of overwork in that kind of context? Are there, especially if we're moving to more flexible and empowered and self-empowered ways of working, and you made the comment that it's not positive if people end up working all hours as a result of moving to flexible work. What was the data that you saw in the study? What are the drivers, perhaps, do you think, of the fact that, first of all, if everyone's saying they're overworked, that their work hours didn't go up when they were working remotely? Was that because they were already working far too long hours?
They did average like 47 hours a week already, right? So we were just relieved we weren't exacerbating that problem further. I think in the pandemic, I'm going to switch back to that part of the story, where, of course, is a little less data driven, but we know that some people had decreased work hours because of caregiving responsibilities, but many people actually saw their hours creep up quite a bit during the pandemic. I think that the strategies that I've talked about, which are really centered on team conversations, they're really centered on good management principles, but carving out the time to have those conversations about how we work together. That needs to explicitly address expectations for how quickly we respond to each other, explicitly address, as you and I have chatted about, Peter, that, just because I have insomnia and was up at 3:30 this morning and shot you an email doesn't mean I expect an answer by 7 a.m. And what has happened in many organizations, and was true in the firm that we studied, is that there's a sense of, when people have a sense of job insecurity, when they feel like they're going to be evaluated for very long hours and for being willing to do whatever it takes to get it done, then they feel that pressure to respond instantly. But that way of working sets up these negative patterns where people are, frantic and responsive, but not doing the quality work that they could do, and not being strategic in the way that we would hope knowledge workers would be able to enact and share their talents and skills.
Great. And your mention of knowledge workers just there at the end reminds me of another question that I saw earlier that had to do with, you specifically studied people working in the IT sector in this study. What are your thoughts about generalizing your findings to other industries and maybe even to some extent other kinds of work?
Yeah. So, I think that there are ways that we can take some of these core ideas about how can we support employees' sense of choice and control? How can we signal that we trust and support employees as managers? Those are broadly applicable across the board, right? So there are studies of nurses who, of course, have to work on site, but can do some self-scheduling, can have some more say in which shifts they work. And we see positive benefits from that research as well. So I think the kind of big messages apply very broadly, and that our findings I would expect to apply in many different white-collar settings. I see in the Q&A, I just happen to have it up to the side, any solutions for preventing flexibility stigma? I would like to answer that because it touches on the gender equity questions. I think it's really important that flexible work arrangements be framed broadly as an effort to do the work well and address people's legitimate personal and health needs. But it shouldn't be framed as a work-family solution or a work-family issue, because when we get into the work-family conversations, unfortunately, we end up kind of triggering the cultural messages about mothers and mothers, the ideology that mothers may be less committed. And so we suggest really stepping back from a work-family framing to say, this is about new ways of working. This is of interest to everyone. And this is about how we work together well as a team. And that kind of universal approach normalizes it. It also supports the many men who are dads or have other caregiving responsibilities, as well as people whose health may make it important that they have a little bit more time at home. So that's kind of what our research suggests is the strategy, broadening it and making about new ways of working.
That's great. And related to that equity point as well, what are your thoughts about what the availability of these kinds of approaches to flexible and hybrid working is? If you're in many organizations, there may be people whose roles, you mentioned professions where you have to be on site. But if you think about organizations where maybe more senior people are being given access to more flexibility, and more junior people are being told still you've got to turn up at the office every day or not have that kind of control. Do you think that's a really critical risk factor for organizations that are designing these systems now? That if you say a perception of inequity around access to flexibility?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I would say pre-pandemic, when we had the mother may I individually negotiated model, it was very common, professors don't have to ask anybody, right? But the financial staff who support my grants or the people who are working with students, they had to really negotiate and justify their flexible work arrangements. Now, of course, as I've said, the job should drive what's feasible, right? So if you need to interact with clients or customers face-to-face, well, we've learned that maybe you don't need to interact full-time face-to-face, but of course you would be expected to be in there a longer period of time. So I think the equity questions are really important. And I guess my main points would be the work should drive those decisions, not the status, not, what are we comfortable with, but can the work be done in a remote fashion or in a hybrid fashion? And secondly, as you noted, when some of us had it and some of us didn't, and the pandemic meant everyone had it, it feels unjust to pull all the way back and say, okay, now professors continue doing whatever the heck they want to, and the grants administrators doing the work have to be in the office and on campus 5 days a week. So being attuned to that dynamic of what did I have, and then does it feel like a loss, is another important lesson.
On your point about being sort of role and function specific, one thing that we did with the exec ed team 4 or 5 years ago was we kind of made a commitment and said we felt strongly that everybody should have access to some amount of flexible. And if their job design made that impossible, we committed to try to change their job design so that everyone would have access. But do you think that was is that approach something which it worked for us because of the nature of our work, perhaps? But I wonder, is that the kind of approach that we could look to leaders in organizations to commit to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a terrific approach. As you know, I'm a big fan of exec ed as pioneers on this, but I also think it's legitimate to say to an employee, in this role, this is what we need. If that's no longer what you prefer, then how can we help you find a role where more flexibility in location or more remote work is feasible given the tasks at hand?
Great, thank you. I'm just going back. We've got such a long list of questions. I'm trying to make sure that we don't miss any other important ones. As I'm looking through back at my notes as well. One of the, there was a question in there, and I think you've addressed it, but it's raised an important point that somebody asked about, as a leader in an organization, I think this was a director of a smaller company, what kind of data should I be looking at to know whether people are working effectively if we introduce this kind of much more flexible and hybrid system? The question was, should I be asking everyone for a daily report of what they did, for example?
So, my answer here is, how did you know before when you were all working in the office? How did you know what counted as good work in the more traditional setting? That question, that response back comes from the organizational development consultants who worked with us to implement this. And I thought it was such a wise point. When people are worried about performance in a remote setting, what it does is reveal that you didn't have good performance measures in the office either, right? And so the orientation should be, what do I need from this person? And, how do they contribute to the team and to the larger goals? And how are we going to measure that, regardless of where they're working? And so I think there's a temptation to say, oh, they're going to go off and slack, right? First of all, the data across the economy suggests that people were as productive or more productive in the last year. But second of all, they might have been slacking in a less visible way when they were right in front of you.
Right. I think some people have been putting some in the chat, some useful suggestions and thoughts about that as well. And I'm just scanning through again. You touched on this actually, but again, I think it's a really important point. Someone asks, how do we engage middle managers around these questions? And so, oftentimes it feels like, if we read the news, it feels like what's happening in any particular organization or company is very much the result of a top-down sort of edict from the philosophy of whoever the leaders are. But we all know that actually getting things done in organization requires a different kind of engagement. So what did you find in your study, and what advice do you have for how do we really engage those vital middle managers in this process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's important to realize that middle managers may or may not be supportive of this move, because it does feel like I used to call the shots and now it's kind of collaboratively decided by the team, right? And so many middle managers may experience this as an important change in their role. And so we have to acknowledge that, and we have to train and learn from each other, set up some peer learning so that people who are more comfortable with it and feel excited about it can answer their peers' questions. That was part of what happened in our workshops in the initiative. We had some manager-only sessions where peer could talk to peer about, here's what I'm worried about, and then someone who was 6 months further down the journey could share their experiences. Just because of time, I'm going to say in the book, we do have an appendix at the end that is ideas for individuals and ideas for managers on some specific tactics to take to get more comfortable with this and to promote these kinds of work design perspectives in your own organization.
Great, thank you. And well, you mentioned time. It looks like we're just about running out, so there's just about enough time for me to thank you for spending this time with us. We know how much demand you're in, especially given what's going on in the world at the moment, and to thank everyone who logged in and listened to this conversation. And keep an eye out, everyone, we will send out the recording and some of the other links that were mentioned. If you're fascinated by or concerned about, or you want to sort of really learn more about this, as Erin mentioned at the end, we certainly thoroughly recommend her book, which describes the research that we talked about today. And also we have upcoming, if you go to the MIT Sloan Executive Education website, or you can see it here on this slide, or you will be able to shortly, the upcoming courses in September, which is three half days with Erin diving more deeply into some of these questions, and which will also, if you complete that, result in your ability to earn a certificate from that program, which we like to do as well. And also, please do keep an eye out for future messages from us, or take a look at our website for upcoming webinars in this series. This is something that we increased the frequency of at the start of the pandemic to really help share the thought leadership from faculty who teach in our executive education programs with you, our wider participant community. And we love how many of you are engaging and interacting with us in these, and we look forward to seeing many of you again in future ones. So once again, thank you, Professor Erin Kelly. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for the team behind the scenes who have been making this all work. And thank you to all of you. And keep on innovating. And we hope that you will be able to move the needle in a significant way with your own teams from some of the insights and advice that you have heard today.